Hello everyone, this is Matthew Jenna for Card Runners, and I'm here with Tournament Theory Concepts Part 1. So for this video, I wanted to start with a disclosure. I have minimal tournament experience. I have not played much since Black Friday to begin with, but I've played approximately 0 tournaments in the last 3.5 years. You have a right to know this and decide if you think you'd rather not spend your time discussing tournaments with a non-tournament player. That said, despite never advertising for it, I have coached a few tournament players who've contacted me for theory coaching and learned a ton about tournaments through coaching them. I think I've learned enough to make a pretty good video on how to adjust to tournaments when coming from cash games. I actually think this series is going to be very good, but I don't want anyone to feel cheated out of their time, so I just wanted to get this information out there. I have not played tournaments recently, but I have discussed them a lot, so I think I have a lot to say about the topic. Goals for these videos. My goal is to explain how to apply some theoretical concepts to tournaments and get a pretty big edge over players who don't understand these concepts, and that's most of the tournament playing population. Many concepts will have already been discussed in cash games, but they need to be adjusted for stack depth, antes, and ICM. We will not talk too much about exploitative play here or ICM here. These videos will be theory and concept based. So I'm not going to talk about ICM just because I don't think I'm the best person to do that, and I think there's a lot of other content that we can talk about that I haven't seen discussed elsewhere that will be really beneficial for people to hear. So without further ado, let's jump into the first big concept, which is preflop stack depth. In cash games, when you look at a preflop situation, you look at your hand, the previous action, and your position. In tournaments, you must also look at stack depth. In addition to impacting how often you'll be called, 3-bet, or shipped on, stack depth significantly impacts the strength of your actual holding. Stack depth and robust equity. One of the most common mistakes I see people make is emphasize hands with robust equity when there is little stack depth. That's especially true if players have come from cash games or spent a lot of time talking with cash game players, since these games are played with more stack depth. When you're playing cash games, almost everyone is used to playing 100 big blinds deep. When you're playing tournaments, very rarely are you 100 big blinds or deeper. You're almost always significantly more shallow than that. Additionally, hands with robust equity are usually easier to play, so there's a bias for that even in cash games where people like to play with the pretty hands that can make the nuts rather than, the more difficult hands that can be more profitable. In other words, which hand is better to raise first in on the button, King 10 off or 7-6 suited? Well, there's no way to know for sure, but for 100 big blind stack depths at no limit 200, Poker Snowy predicts the expected value of opening King 10 off on the button is worth 0.16 big blinds compared to opening 7-6 suited, which is worth 0.2 big blinds. This probably isn't surprising. Most players watching this video probably value 7-6 suited more highly than King 10 off. So if you're like me and you're like Poker Snowy and you think 7-6 suited is better than King 10 off, ask yourself for a minute why that is. Again, if you're playing with 100 big blinds deep stack depth. Well, the answer probably is that with 7-6 suited, it's a lot easier to make a nut type hand than with King 10 off. So if you have 100 big blind stack depth and you want to win a really, really big pot, you're probably going to need to make like a flush or a straight, which 7-6 suited is a lot better at doing than King 10 off. So, because we have all that stack depth, 7-6 suited is overall a more profitable hand to open with than King 10 off, despite the fact that King 10 off has a lot more equity than 7-6 suited. 7-6 suited's equity is more robust. In other words, it can make hands that are very, very strong and will win at showdown even if we're playing against a really strong range. Now let's change the stack depth. But what if we're only 25 big blinds deep? And all other players are this deep too, so we're 25 big blinds effective. On the button rather than 100 big blinds deep. How does the EV of both hands change? Well, again, I asked Poker Snowy, and King 10 off now has an EV of 0.12 big blinds, so King 10 off's EV has decreased. But wait, 7-6 suited now has an EV of 0 big blinds. In other words, it thinks it's a mixed strategy between folding and opening. So pause for a moment and realize what I'm saying. I'm saying that when 25 big blinds deep with no antes, Poker Snowy believes 7-6 suited isn't even a profitable raising hand. It thinks it's a mixed strategy. You can either raise it or not. That's huge to me. Most people will slam dunk raise 7-6 suited on the button like their life depends on it, even if you're shallow, like 25 big blinds deep, and even if you're shallower than that, because they're used to, when the stack depth is greater, being very happy with 7-6 suited on the button and opening it. And wait for it. And 7-5 suited is a fold preflop, again according to Snowy, and again with no antes. We're going to talk about antes a lot later, so don't worry. Oh snap. Most people probably think 7-5 suited is a very easy raise on the button, even when stack depth gets shallow. This is huge. But why is this? Why did the hand values change? Pause and think, even though we've already talked about it a little bit. Really pause and think. So what's different when we have low stack depth? Well, we can't win as much money when we make the nuts, and that's what hands with robust equity like 7-6 of diamonds or 7-5 of diamonds do. It's just not that big of a deal to make the nuts when we can only win 25 or 20 or 30 big blinds. We want to make nut type hands when we're deep. They're not as useful when we're shallow. It's also harder for our opponent to push us off our equity and for us to push our opponent off his equity. For example, if we're only 25 big blinds deep, like in the previous example, you can't really make me hate my life with top pair. You simply don't have the stack depth to apply enough pressure against me to really make me want to fold a good pair. The kind of lines top pair good kicker hates to play against, such as triple barrels and overbets, aren't even possible. So again, let's talk about this for a little bit. With king 10 off, what really sucks, and it doesn't matter if it's button versus big blind or pretty much any position, what really sucks with king 10 off is when you face a ton of pressure and you have a marginal pair. It's not possible for that to happen when we're only 25 big blinds deep. The lines that I hate to face when I have a marginal pair are like triple barrels or overbets, and there's no stack depth, so those lines just aren't even possible. So that makes king 10 off better than it would otherwise be in a lot of spots because we can't face the lines that we hate. Now let's talk about 7-6 of diamonds. This hand often doubles and triple barrels very well when we have a lot of stack depth. It can't do it here. There's no stack depth, so you're not going to get in a situation where you can bet flop, bet turn, and whiff on the river with 7-6 of diamonds, and then make a nice big bet, possibly even an overbet, and then put a ton of pressure on your opponent. We don't have the stack depth to utilize that. Likewise, when we do actually make the nuts with 7-6 of diamonds, again, we're just not going to get paid all that well because our opponent doesn't have that much money, and neither do we. So 7-6 of diamonds is a much less valuable hand than it would otherwise be. Let's continue examining preflop with Poker Snowy. Suppose we have ace-8 off in the cutoff and are 100 big blinds deep. What does Poker Snowy say we should do? Well, Poker Snowy says drop it like it's hot. It says it's a negative EV open, so you want to just fold it. And I imagine almost everyone watching this folds ace-8 off on the cutoff really quickly and doesn't worry about it. Why? Why are you folding ace-8 off? Because that hand has a lot of equity. Make sure you understand that. Ace-8 off actually has a lot of equity, a lot more equity than a hand like 7-5 suited, even though people usually open 7-5 suited in the cutoff but fold ace-8 off. Again, why are we folding ace-8 off? The answer is because there's a lot of stack depth and ace-8 off can't make any nut type hands. So it has a lot of EV, but the EV isn't very robust. It's hard to make better than meh hands with ace-8 off. Now suppose we have ace-8 off in the cutoff and we're 25 big blinds deep. So to be clear, again, all players have 25 big blinds. What does Snowy say we should do? Well, here it says raise and the EV is 0.04 big blinds. I could list more raise first in examples, but I won't. Snowy does not actually know the expected value of any hand. It's just making an educated guess. So there's little point in showing more examples when the concepts behind it are much more important. Overall, the examples are consistent with the theory for stack depth and robust equity that was around much before Poker Snowy. So Poker Snowy just matches what we'd expect. So in other words, I like Poker Snowy, but I'm just saying I'm using Poker Snowy to help me illustrate concepts that I already believed and already understood. These weren't concepts that were found through Poker Snowy. So the theory, like the take-home message, is robust equity is more valuable as stacks get deeper. Non-robust equity is more valuable than it would otherwise be as stacks get shallower. So now we're going to talk about 3-betting with non-robust equity. The same concept applies when 3-betting preflop. For 100 big blind stacks, most players like hands with some robust equity, like 7-6 suited. They're easy to play and can make monster hands. In fact, I even think for 100 big blind stacks, people are too biased towards liking hands with really robust equity. Like they'll like 3-betting a hand like 7-6 suited, even if King 7 suited is better. So this even applies for 100 big blind stacks, but especially as you get shallower, you need to start emphasizing different types of hands. So when stacks get shallow, maybe ace 10 off, king jack off, king 10 off make better 3-bet hands in certain spots, such as when we're in the small blind and the button opens, as we'll often not want to call. So again, it depends on the stack depth and not always, and you're going to want to look at reads because you're not playing against GTO opponents in a vacuum or anything like that. But you want to consider 3-betting with some hands that you might not otherwise 3-bet with as stacks get more shallow. Because just like we talked about, when there's not a lot of stack depth, making a pretty good pair is actually really good. Whereas if there is a lot of stack depth, making a pretty good pair can actually not be that great when you're under a lot of pressure. Hand example. Let's use Snowy again to illustrate a concept. What does Snowy think we should do with ace 10 off in the small blind when facing a 2.25 big blind open from the button when we're 100 big blinds deep? So again, pause for a moment and think, make a guess at it. It's a pretty small open, but what does Snowy say? Well, it says we should fold 95% and raise 5%. So in other words, Snowy of course doesn't know, but it thinks the EV of 3-betting and folding are both 0, but we should still mostly be folding. We don't want too many ace 10 offs in our 3-betting range at least. What does Snowy think we should do with ace 10 off in the small blind when facing a 2.25 big blind open from the button? When we're 40 big blinds deep. I'm going to ninja edit that right now. All right, edited through the magic of cinema. So again, pause for a moment and think, what should we do with ace 10 off when we're in the small blind and the button open for 2.25 big blinds and we're only 40 big blinds deep? So, since stacks are shallower, now we're going to be able to better utilize less robust equity. All right, so what does Snowy think? It says we should 3-bet it every single time. And the EV is substantial, 0.4 big blinds. So that might not seem like much, but that's a lot. Half a big blind more, a little less than half a big blind, but about half of a big blind more EV from 3-betting rather than folding. That's pretty substantial for a pre-flop spot. So just so you know, that is quite a lot. Again, why? Why are we 3-betting this here? Now, if you've played cash games, you probably actually have a lot of experience 3-betting a hand like ace 10 off from the small blind against a button open, and then getting a 10 high flop, but then an overcard turns, or getting an ace high flop and then facing a lot of pressure, and really hating the hand. That's why there's such a strong bias to 3-bet the hands like 7-6 suited. I personally like ace 10 off more than 7-6 suited, even when we're 100 big blinds deep, and I'm in the small blind and the button opens. But I think most people don't. And the reason for that is the 7-6 suited is a lot easier to play, and it's just a lot more pleasurable of an experience to either sort of make the nuts or bluff your opponent off a better hand with 7-6 suited than it is to have ace 10 off and go, oh, what do I do? I hate this. This is so tricky. But if we're only 40 big blinds deep, it's a lot harder to hate life. Because honestly, if I flop an ace, I'm probably just not going anywhere, and if I get stacked, so be it. And if the flop comes 10 high, that's actually still pretty awesome even for 100 big blinds deep. But if the flop comes 10 high, we're in great shape, whether we're 40 or 100 big blinds deep. But a middle pair is also maybe a little bit easier to use when you're shallower rather than deeper, because it's harder for our opponent to push us off our equity. He just can't make giant bets. It's not possible. I'm thinking right now, and honestly, if I 3-bet ace 10 off for 100 big blinds and I flop a middle pair, I'm going to get pushed off it really often, and that sucks. But if we're 40 big blinds deep, there's probably some runouts where I will end up folding it, but for the most part, I think I can actually stack off ace 10 off when ace 10 off flops the middle pair and we're 40 big blinds deep. Again, it depends on the runout. If you give like a terrible runout, you're going to end up folding it. But on, since we've already maybe have the pot like 17 or 18 big blinds, and we only have 33 big blinds behind on the flop, I don't think we're folding middle pair with ace 10 off very often, so we can kind of just like shrug and stack it off even if we don't love it. So ace 10 off does play a lot more effectively when you have shallow stack depth rather than deep stack. And again, the opposite of this is also true. So if the button opens and stacks are 40 big blinds deep, I hate it when I see someone 3-bet 7-6 suited in the small blind. It's extremely common. And even the students I've gotten that were already quite good tournament players, a lot of them just thought 3-betting 7-6 suited there is just totally standard, even like from a theoretical perspective, because it has such robust equity, and that's what cash game players like to do. But I think 3-betting 7-6 suited there is pretty bad because it doesn't have the right type of equity. I'm actually going to go double check it in Snowy. I just thought of that as I'm recording that, and I just like using Snowy to analyze stuff. So I'll be right back. All right, so let's do it. I haven't actually looked at this yet, but I'm guessing Snowy's going to really hate 3-betting in the small blind with a suited connector here. All right, the moment of anticipation. Am I wrong? In which case I'll just edit it out, and you guys will never know the difference. No, it doesn't like it. It has a substantial negative EV. And then ace 10 off, as I already mentioned, it's about 0.4. Yeah, a little bit more than that even. So if you look, I mean, we could try different hands. I don't really think it's all that important, but you can see Snowy is not liking 3-betting these hands with robust equity. Whereas let's see if we were deeper. If we were deeper, I still don't think Snowy likes 3-betting suited connectors there. As I said, I'm not a huge fan of it either, but I think it might hate it less. Yeah, so now it's a mixed strat. So between folding and raising just a little bit. So Snowy, again, all the stuff we're talking about was already pretty well understood before even playing with Snowy, but it's cool to see Snowy be like, hey, yeah, the theory that you guys had, the AI thinks it's right too. So yeah, 3-betting suited connectors here when you're deeper is probably okay. If Snowy says it's a mixed strategy, again, it really doesn't know, and in practice it might be pretty good, but as you get shallow, Snowy thought it was pretty bad, and I think it's pretty bad too, at least without a read on your opponent or the general tendencies of the player pool you're against. All right, now think about how often this comes up. As a cash game player, you probably have your default pre-flop opening, 3-betting, and calling ranges that you autopilot while you play. I know I do. But for tournaments, you need to constantly be adjusting your ranges. If you constantly fold hands worth 5/100ths of a big blind preflop, or open with hands that are negative 5/100ths of a big blind preflop, that's going to add up fast because these spots occur so often. So this isn't because the EV of each of these spots is huge, but because these spots occur so frequently. So think about how this might impact your big blinds 1 per 100 hands, because even though the EV for each individual hand is small, it's going to come up a lot of times, even in probably just 100 hands. That said, for 3-betting, the EV can still be pretty substantial. So as we already saw with ace 10 off, it had a positive EV of being 3-bet of 0.4 big blinds in the spot we discussed where we were 40 big blinds deep, whereas 3-betting 7-6 suited was negative around something like 0.3 or 0.4 big blinds. So when we're talking about 3-betting with this concept, you actually can have a pretty substantial EV. Whereas when you're talking about just opening, the EV is not as big, but it happens so often that you still want to get better at it. And you can still totally apply these concepts with reads, and I would do it if I ever played at a site that allowed a HUD. But without reads, it's important to understand this stuff and not just think you always have to stick with default ranges when you're playing tournaments, because your ranges are going to change a lot when the stack depth changes. And that's hard. That's not an easy thing to do. All right, so what to take from this? Again, I'm not a tournament player, so I don't have any cool hands I've played to show you, and there probably aren't really any cool hands to illustrate this concept to begin with, because we're talking about sort of a death by 1,000 cuts type of deal. You know, there's not like this big awesome concept where it's some super profitable play that happens rarely. These are slightly profitable plays that happen all the time. But let's again stress the take-home message. Robust equity is more valuable as stacks get deeper, whereas non-robust equity is more useful as stacks get shallower. That is by far the most important thing to understand. It's a big deal, and it's hard to constantly take this into account. Cash game players often joke about document players, but they essentially have to deal with another constantly changing variable. I was very surprised at how hard this was to do when I started coaching tournament players. I thought it was just like, oh, tournament players have all these leaks. There's so many casual players. It's going to be so easy. To really play tournaments well is hard because this variable changes your ranges so much. And this isn't easy. The most common mistake I make when coaching tournament players is not adequately adjusting for stack depth. And honestly, it's probably their most common mistake that they make too, even if they only play tournaments and never cash games. They still constantly don't adjust properly for stack depth. So get excited, we're moving on to the second big concept, which is post-flop stack depth. So now we need to understand some basic theory involved with when playing with small stack depth post-flop. Remember, if we played well pre-flop, then we have already emphasized non-robust equity when we're 25 big blinds deep more than we would have if we were 100 big blinds deep. So we've already set ourselves up to have the right types of hands post-flop. Playing better on earlier streets always makes it easier to play well on later streets. And that's all we're seeing here. So for now, again, assume no antes. We're going to get to that. Let's start off with an example. Suppose the button min raises and the small blind folds. What should we do with king 10 off in the big blind when the button is 100 big blinds deep? So what do? The button min raised. We call. What if we're 20 big blinds deep? We call. Yep, we're in the big blind, so calling is pretty awesome here. We can't get squeezed. I think both are easy calls and not close in case you were leveling yourself after the last example. Because remember, we talked about 3-betting with hands that have non-robust equity, so you might see king 10 off and go, maybe I should apply that concept right now and 3-bet it. It doesn't work very well when you're in the big blind. When you're in the big blind, you can just close the action, just call with it, keep your opponent's dominated hands in. Maybe we can talk when we're in the small blind, but for at least the big blind, you call whether or not you're 100 big blinds deep or 25 big blinds deep. Applying concepts is hard, and when I teach a concept, I almost always try to show like the clearest, cleanest examples. So they're always harder to apply in practice than they look in videos. I know. All right, so let's see the flop. So we have king 10 off. What do we do if the flop comes 10, 7, 4 with 2 hearts? We check, and the opponent bets 2.25 big blinds, and we are 100 big blinds deep. So what would you do here? 100 big blinds deep. I would snap call. I think it's pretty interesting to raise like the ace 10 and we can go on a whole big thing. But I think with like king 10 and queen 10, I would call, and I don't really think it's all that close. I mean, maybe king 10's a little close, but I would definitely call. How about 25 big blinds deep? The whole reason why I made this hand example, not to rant about 100 big blinds. For 25 big blinds deep, what would you do? I would snap raise. Why? Pause and think. So why is it a snap call when we're 100 big blinds deep and a snap raise when we're 25 big blinds deep? I mean, really pause and think. Why do I like raising here? I like raising. The first reason is we can't get pushed off our equity. So if we call, it's possible we get like a bad turn and a bad river and we end up having to fold. Whereas if we raise, the pot's going to get so big so fast that there's no way we don't either get to showdown or just win right now. Or I guess we could bet the turn and our opponent folds. But we're never going to end up folding our hand if we raise on the flop. Reason number 2. We can push our opponent off his equity, and the pot now is big relative to stack depth. Even if we just make our opponent fold 1 overcard, you know, it's possible our opponent was going to outdraw us. It's also possible our opponent has something like Jack 9, which is drawing to like an 8 and a Jack. So he's got effectively 7 outs there. So it's important to push our opponent off his equity. Even though 7 outs might not seem like a lot, if the pot's already big relative to stack depth, then it becomes more valuable to push our opponent off his equity. Hopefully that's all really intuitive. You know, if there's a lot of money in the pot relative to what we have, then we really want to make our opponent fold now and win, you know, this big pot relative to the amount of money we have behind. Reason number 3 is since the pot is big relative to stack depth, we'll stack many of the opponent's weaker pairs. If we were deeper and we check raise king 10, you know, it's possible we don't really make the pot effectively all that much bigger against our opponent's, you know, queen 10, jack 10, 10, 9. We probably make it a little bit bigger, but not all that much bigger because our opponent's not going to end up felting those hands. We're not going to stack our opponent when we have king 10 and our opponent has jack 10. But when we're shallow, we are going to stack our opponent when he has pretty much any 10, and we also probably are going to end up stacking him when he has a good 7 that bet the flop. So we're able to check raise a lot more comfortably because of that. All right. Reason number 4 is probably the trickiest one to talk about, and it ties in very heavily with reason number 1. We can't get 3-bet. So I almost went on a tangent right off the bat, even though that was not what I wanted to illustrate here, which is for 100 big blinds deep, you actually, I think, can raise ace-10 in a big blind versus button spot on the 10-7-4 board. I do that a lot more than most people do, and it's a very risky line, and it's a line that's very difficult to play. But you definitely can justify raising ace-10 on a 10-7-4 board, button versus big blind, because you're like, well, when I raise ace-10, I'm ahead of a whole lot of my opponent's, value betting range on the flop where I can get more money in, and I can deny my opponent some equity, and it allows you to do some weird stuff later where you can bet flop, bet turn, maybe check call some rivers. So you can raise ace-10 on the 10-7-4 board. I think king-10 would be quite a bit too aggressive. I think there's a big difference in ace-10 and king-10 here. But what really sucks about doing it is when you get 3-bet on the flop. So it sucks super badly when you check raise ace-10 on this 10-7-4 board, and you're hoping your opponent folds or calls, then all of a sudden he goes, boom, small 3-bet. Because his 3-betting range is going to be very polarized, and it really makes your ace-10 not very good anymore, right? Because we were check raising ace-10 on the flop, kind of either hoping our opponent folded or he called our check raise with jack-10 or queen-10 or, some 7. Didn't happen. When we're shallow, our opponent doesn't have enough stack depth to make us hate his 3-bets on the flop. So that's also why raising with king-10 is so good here. If we have king-10 and our opponent has pocket queens, whatever, fine, we're getting stacked either way, we'll just lose. Whereas if we're 100 big blinds deep, and we have ace-10 or king-10, and we decide to go for a really aggressive line, like check raise the flop, and as I said, I do it pretty often with ace-10, you end up losing a lot more money against your opponent's better hands. So the other reason why I like raising with king-10 off here when we're shallow is we just don't have to fear that 3-bet. We were going to get stacked either way if our opponent has pocket jacks, so we can just, raise the flop, deny him his equity, try to make the pot a little bit bigger, and we know if we do get stacked, we were going to get stacked either way. So here's a pretty common question that I get asked. Yo, Janda, how deep do you need to be to call king-10 in the 10-7-4 spot rather than check raise? Yeah, that's the tricky part. So again, I try to illustrate concepts in the clearest way possible at first, but then actual real poker happens where there's lots of things going on at once and it's not usually that clear what to do. So the good news is most tournament players are so bad. Keep in mind, tournaments are often more fun than cash games and full of weak players, that even if you start with just identifying the easy spots, you'll be doing pretty well. So even if you can just do the easy spots at first, I think that's still very valuable. Pick the low-hanging fruit before you try to pick the high-hanging fruit. I can always guess, but there's no way to pinpoint the exact stack depth before king-10 becomes a call rather than a raise. In general, I tend to more aggressively attempt to deny equity than most with strong but not incredibly strong hands, even when it can result in me getting an in behind. So an example of this would be, if the cutoff opens, I still have a calling range in the button, but if the cutoff opens for 100 big blind stack depth, I will 3-bet 10s as part of my, sort of polarized 3-betting range there. I don't want to get called. I definitely don't want to get 4-bet. But I will still 3-bet 10s there because I want to deny my opponent the ability to realize his equity. And even if I get called, 10s are still pretty good. What sucks is when I get 4-bet, and I'm just willing to let that happen, more so than most people. That same concept applies post-flop. You saw that I would often raise the ace-10, even for 100 big blind stack depth in this spot. I don't think most people raise ace-10 here. It's very aggressive, and you can get into some pretty gross spots. So, given all that, even if we were 40 big blinds deep, I'd still strongly consider check raising, but it depends on other variables too. We're going to talk about antes in the next video, and that could also impact what we do. Antes are a huge deal. So just know, even though I picked 25 big blinds deep, which I think makes it a pretty easy raise, I would still raise it even if we were quite a bit deeper. But there's no way to pinpoint the exact stack depth. So I think this is a pretty good stopping point for the first video. So in the second video, I'll pick up right where we left off. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something. We're going to keep talking a lot more about these concepts and tie in other concepts in the second video. So if you're watching this and the second video is out and you're ready to keep going, save your questions, watch the second video, and we're going to pick up right where we left. So thank you for watching. Good luck, everyone. Take care.